Good evening, everybody. I know most of you have been here, but for those who may not have been here before, Roots and Roads Community Hospice Foundation, our vision is to transform the end of life experience into the final act of living well, whatever that means for each of us. But the way we go about that in our work is 3 or 4 parts now. We provide financial assistance to hospice patients of limited means and their families for basic necessities like housing, transportation, food, caregiving, things that aren't covered by health insurance. So that's what we were sort of established 23 or so years ago. That was kind of the dream of what we were established to do, and we continue to do that today. And soon on the heels of that, we've probably been doing this for about 22 years now, is community education around end-of-life issues, what we're gathered for here tonight. And then we also last year launched our online resource called the Crosswalk, which helps people navigate end of life beginning at time of diagnosis with things like questions you might want to ask your doctor, right? What to figure out what sort of treatment or no treatment or palliative care, whatever it is. And it walks people through all the way to bereavement, to everything in between, including tips for caregivers. We have a lot of healthcare partners whose staff actually use it because they're not all experts in end of life either. And so we would love for you to visit our website and look at the Crosswalk and give us feedback. And maybe there are, I have no doubt, things that we are missing, elements that we would love you to tell us about. I do, before turning it over to David, want to especially thank one of our board members, B. Krause, who was a teaching colleague at the College of New Rochelle with Dr. Doka and lured him into being with us tonight. So thank you so much, B. And without further ado, I will turn it over to our Director of Community Engagement, David Fife. David?
Howdy, everybody. Thanks so much, Julie. We want to begin by thanking so many of you all, individual donors who make this possible for us to be able to have this type of education event. So thank you to all these people listed who donated specifically for this session tonight. And we also want to thank our series sponsors. The Legacy Foundation of Southeast Arizona has made generous financial support for Roots and Roads to be able to provide this year-long series. And we also have an Anonymous Family Foundation donor, and we're so grateful to both of them. And also this year, we have specific session sponsors. Harmony Community Healthcare was one of them. Pima Council on Aging is another one. And tonight, we are so grateful to Right at Home in-home care and assistance, who is bringing us this session. Right at Home is an amazing community supporter on so many different levels and has been a supporter of Roots and Roads for many years. They provide individualized care to each client and making it flexible to their specific needs. Right at Home works to provide the safety net that is most needed for people to remain in their home. So thank you so much to Right at Home in-home care and assistance. And now we want to warmly welcome Dr. Kenneth Doka. He's a professor emeritus at the Graduate School of the College of New Rochelle and senior vice president for grief programs for the Hospice Foundation of America. It's through his work with the Hospice Foundation of America that I came to know Dr. Doka. Hospice and palliative care professionals, as well as bereavement counselors throughout the country, have benefited from Dr. Doka's education programs and sessions. He has touched many lives and has reminded us all of the core values and principles of the hospice movement. We're very grateful to have Dr. Doka with us tonight. And I encourage everyone to go to Dr. Doka's website to see his full biography. Dr. Doka, we'll turn things over to you now. Thank you again for being with us.
Thank you very much, and I'm delighted and honored to be here with you tonight. What we're going to talk about tonight is the mind-body connection in grief. And I always like to start with the next slide. And I don't know if any of you ever worked as a day camp, as a counselor at a sleepaway camp, or went to a sleepaway camp. But one of the questions I often ask is, who sees the homesick kids first? And the answer is usually the nurse. Because the kids are, and homesickness is really a grief reaction. You're separated from former attachments at home, at neighborhood, at family. And so children often have what we call conversion reactions. And we'll talk a little bit more about those a little bit later on. So they go to the nurse and they're not complaining that they're homesick, although a smart nurse will realize that. But their stomach hurts, their legs hurt, and they're really having, and their grief is coming out physically. We see that in a lot of different populations, including disenfranchised grievers. That is, particularly grievers who don't have good social support, or whose grief is not, whose emotions are not validated. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on too. So our goals and objectives for tonight, as the next slide shows, are really to delineate the different ways that grief can be manifested, to describe particularly the physical manifestations of the grief and factors that might influence what we call these conversion reactions, to describe two of these kinds of things where grief affects our physical health, the empty arm syndrome, broken heart syndrome, and discuss the data on mortality and morbidity, and some of the new research on the way that brain processes are actively affected by grief, and that's relatively new. And then, of course, we'll conclude by discussing interventive strategies for building resilience. Let me just make a few points about grief as our next slide shows, what I call Grief 101. Grief affects us in many ways. We often think about it as an emotional reaction, but as we're going to see, it can affect us physically, it can affect us emotionally, it can affect our cognitive processes, it can affect our behavior, and it can affect us spiritually. And again, it's influenced by many factors: our relationship with the person who died, the circumstances of the death, our culture, our spirituality, a whole host of factors. That's another lecture in and of itself. The other thing we want to remind people is that grief is not a time-bound process that ends in detachment. A number of years ago, Freud wrote a brilliant article in 1917 that really started the study of grief. And while the article was brilliant and dealt with some very interesting questions that we still deal with today, like the relationship of grief and depression, Freud emphasized that ultimately we withdraw emotional energy from the deceased and reinvest it in others. We know now that that's not the case. We always maintain a continuing bond with the deceased. They always are part of our memories, part of our biography. We have retain all sorts of connection with them. So now we talk about the amelioration of grief. I don't like to use words like recovery or resolution. I always say if I recover my phone, it means I left it somewhere and I find it. And if I resolve it, I don't find it maybe, but I go to Verizon and get a new one. So I like to use the term amelioration. And that means over time, the intensity of grief diminishes for most people. We return to normal levels of functioning. Some people even grow with grief. But grief still has a developmental effect. And what we mean by that is that because we do retain a continuing bond with the person who's deceased, there may be surges of grief. It may be a little girl who's 6 years old when her dad dies. And 20 years later, she's walking down the aisle, maybe with her stepfather, maybe with her brother, maybe with an uncle, grandfather, maybe with her mother. And as she walks down there at that moment, she feels a surge of grief, even at this happy time, that her father's not walking with her. And that's not unusual. That's quite typical, that we have these surges of grief. Generally, many people still hold to the stage theory of grief, but that was written over 50 years ago, and it's long, almost 50, actually going on 55 years now, and it's long since antiquated. And let me tell you about the two major theories of grief that most people currently work with right now. Next slide, please. And you're going to have to hit that a few times till you get to till I tell you to stop. I put this on animation and that probably didn't work out well. Think one more time. One more. Okay, we're good. So this is a theory of Strobe and Schutt, two researchers and well-respected theorists from the Netherlands. And they talk about the fact that when we're dealing with loss, we're dealing with two major processes. One is we have to deal with the loss itself, the loss-oriented processes. And the second process, I don't like the word restoration as much, particularly, but I like their work very, very much. What we're talking about is living a life now in the face of loss. You know, we have to, even as we deal with our grief, we have to relearn our world. We have to live life differently. And as the little lines in between show, that most people oscillate, and that's healthy. That they move between this. So just to give you an illustration of it, a number of years ago, a widow came into my office. I was working with her, and I said, "How are you doing?" And she said, very proudly, "For the first time since my husband died, I was able to balance the checkbook. That was always his task." And we talked about that and the pride she felt in that. And then the next week when she came in, she said, "You know, when I left your office that day, I kept thinking, but if Tom were alive, I wouldn't have to worry about that." And that's exactly that kind of oscillation that we're seeing. And if we don't oscillate, if we just focus on loss, our grief is going to be chronic. And if we just focus on restoration, our grief is going to be absent or inhibited. The other model of grief, and they're not necessarily incompatible. As a matter of fact, I tend to use both, and you'll see a lot of similarities between them, is the work of William Worden in the next slide. And what William Worden says is that grief has, and again, this was the first move in the early 1980s away from stage theories of grief. And he said grief has a series of tasks. And like any series of tasks, people do those differently. They do those in their own way. They do those in their own time. And he talked about four. One is cognitively, just to acknowledge the loss. Two is to express any emotions, both manifest and latent. Three is to adjust to a life that's changed. And then four, and again, they're not in any order. That's why I don't have them numbered, to relocate the loss. And I felt that there was one thing missing from that. Bill and I still argue about it. He thinks it's part of adjusting to a changed life, is to reconstitute faith in philosophical systems that are challenged by loss. Sometimes a loss challenges our assumptions about the world. It makes the world seem less safe, less benevolent, less predictable. So let's talk about in the next slide about what we know about physical and other manifestations of grief. Next slide. And what we know is, of course, that grief is manifested in all kinds of ways, emotionally, cognitively, spiritually, behaviorally, but also physically. So it comes out in a lot of different ways. Next slide. So for example, and again, you're going to hit that a few times till I tell you to stop. Okay. And you can see that we have many emotions, and this is just a sampling of those. We can have guilt, which itself can be quite varied. We can feel guilty that we did something to cause the death, and that doesn't have to be rational to be real. It could be something like, I should have made him stop smoking. I should have made him go to the doctor sooner, something like that. We may have cultural role guilt. That's guilt like I should have been a better mother, sister, brother, father, son. Moral guilt, this is a punishment. Survivor guilt, it should have been me. Recovery guilt, I'm feeling bad because I'm feeling too good. I shouldn't be enjoying myself given the death I recently experienced or the loss I recently experienced. And grief guilt, I feel bad about feeling bad. My father would be ashamed if he saw I was crying all the time, you know. And then, of course, we can feel relief and sometimes feel guilty about that. Anger, emancipation, sometimes when somebody dies, especially in an oppressive relationship, We can feel a sense of freedom, sadness and loneliness, yearning, fear and anxiety, jealousy. We don't talk about jealousy, but jealousy is often an emotion we feel. How come my husband died or my wife died when yours didn't? And then positive emotions. When a good friend of mine died, I was godfather to his son, and I remember didn't really know the son well. He was only 3 years old at the time of his father's death, but I remember feeling a sense of strong commitment that that I was gonna, I was gonna be there for this kid, and happily, some 30 years later, I can say, yeah, I was, and so there was a good feeling associated with that. Next slide. And of course, just want to draw your attention that guilt can be highly problematic. And again, as we talk about the physical manifestations of grief, research, a study 10 years ago by Lee, Strobe, Chan, and Chow, international study really, indicate that guilt may have highly destructive effects on physical and psychological health. And may even create needs for interventions distinct from even the other emotional reactions of grief. Next slide. We can experience cognitive manifestations of grief and hit those just until it goes to extraordinary experiences. Yep. When we can feel depersonalized, we get in the car, we go someplace, we don't even know how we got there. We can disbelieve and deny about the death. We can idealize or demonize the person who died. One of my professors was Robert Kastenbaum. Actually, he came from Arizona. Well, he came from Boston, but he spent his life teaching in the University of Arizona. And when he was one of my mentors, and one of the things he used to say is even Hitler liked dogs. And what he was trying to say is that even the worst of people sometimes have behaviors that are that at least can be respected and understood. And again, he wasn't trying to defend Hitler in any manner, shape, or form, but he was just making a shocking point to remind us that the problems with idealization and demonization is that most people are neither ideal nor complete demons. We can be preoccupied with the deceased. We can be confused. We can constantly obsess about it, wondering if it could have been prevented. We may be unable to concentrate. We may search for meaning, and we may have extraordinary experiences. And that's a webinar even in and of itself. So as the next slide goes, I'm just going to leave this for you. Do people have access to the slides? They do.
Yeah, they will have access to the slides.
Okay, so you can read this one on your own. It just talks about all the different kinds of experiences. And next slide, please. And again, hit that till you get to the end. What we've learned from the work of Lou Legrand is that people have all kinds of cognitive experiences that we call extraordinary. And that's a good word and not so good word, because they're not all that extraordinary. About 60% of bereaved people have them. Excuse me. And this can be a sense of presence of the deceased, a sense experience where we smell the person, a symbolic experience. The reason I have the hawk here is Lou Legrand got into this field of research because one of his clients came in and said to him, Dr. Legrand, I had the most remarkable experience. On the way to your office is the cemetery where my 16-year-old son died in a car crash, is buried. And he said, when I got there today, I always stopped there on my way to you to say a prayer for my son. And she said, when I got there today, there was a hawk perched on the memorial stone, and it didn't fly away right away. It kind of looked at me, eyed me, and then slowly flew off. And Lou said to her, and that has significance to you? And she says, yeah, my son's nickname was Hawk. So those kinds of experience. Third-party experiences where somebody says something to you that seems almost like a message from the deceased. And then finally, dreams. And those dreams, again, can be very vivid or and symbolic, or what we call visitation dreams. Remember, the insurance policy is in the gray box. Next slide, please. These are the dreams we talked about, very common, and they can be what we call basic grief dreams or visitation dreams. One of my favorite clients talked about a dream where she was on an airplane, and when she got on the airplane, she got on with her mother in the dream, and her mother got up to use the restroom and seemed to be in the restroom for a while on the airplane. And then the announcement came on, please return to your seats, buckle your seatbelts, we're going in for a landing. And so in the dream, she went, this repetitive dream, she went to the flight attendant and said, would you check the restrooms? My mother hasn't returned. And the flight attendant came back and said, there's no one in the restrooms, honey. And that dream troubled her. And one of the techniques I use with dream work is asking people to title the dream. And once she titled it Vanished in Thin Air. She all of a sudden realized her mother's death was sudden. She had played tennis earlier that day. She died of a heart attack in her sleep. So, when she labeled it, she understood what it said, that to her mother had vanished into thin air. Next slide. So these extraordinary experiences are relatively common. About 60% of people experience them, according to a whole line of research over the last number of years. And again, there's cultural variations. Some cultures, they're more inclined to have them, other cultures less so. Next slide. And again, just fill in. And so, if you're a counselor, these experiences have a dual effect on bereaved people, often. Most people find them very, very comforting, but they don't want to share them with anybody else because they think other people are going to think they're crazy. So in my counseling, I always say people have talked to me experiences such as, have you ever had one of those? And the reaction is always remarkable because people will say to me, I never told anybody this, but, sometimes allow of course, the client to interpret it. Sometimes the experiences are negative, and so you have to help them deal with that and understand and reframe it and maybe do some kind of counseling intervention. And other clients may feel bad that the 40% have never had one. So again, you may have to suggest some interventions there. To sum this up in the next slide, these paranormal experiences, again, the question often comes up, how should counselors react when clients seek? They want to go to a medium, they want to have some kind of paranormal experience. And again, my advice always, well, you have to respect the client's spirituality, explore what they're hoping to get, and of course, recognize and assist them as they understand the risk of exploitation, which can be large too. So next slide. We also manifest grief spiritually in behavioral implications, maybe faith struggles, changes in spiritual behavior, things of that nature. And finally, not finally actually, but before we get into the physical reactions, the next slide reminds us that there are behavioral implications. We may lose patterns of behavior. We may have interpersonal changes. We may cry. We may withdraw. We may avoid reminders. We may seek reminders. We may find it hard to function sexually. So there are all kinds of different reactions. But what we really want to stress is in the next slide, which reminds us that not only do we experience grief in all these cognitive and emotional kinds of ways, but it's not atypical to have physical manifestations of grief, headaches, dizziness, exhaustion, digestive difficulties. When I feel a loss, I often find my stomach is upset and unsettled. Sometimes tremors, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Menstrual irregularities, erectile dysfunction, muscular aches. And again, it's important then, as the next two slides show, that we really assess health. And again, hit those, because any physical symptoms ought to be assessed by a knowledgeable physician. So if a client is complaining of physical symptoms, might be just a reaction to grief, might be one of these conversion reactions, but we want to be very careful, particularly with older people, older widows and widowers, because they seem to be at particular risk. There is a higher rate of mortality with grief. And there are reasons for that that are really evidence-based. One is what we call the joint unfavorable environment. And what that means is most people today die of chronic diseases. And most of those chronic diseases have lifestyle factors. So they are likely affecting both members of the dyad. So if your husband is smoking all the time, the wife is being affected by secondhand smoke. Another element is grief is very stressful, and older persons particularly may be less resilient to stress. And then a final factor that we should always assess for is lifestyle changes. Maybe when her spouse was alive, she would make her husband 3 good meals a day, 3 healthy meals a day. Since he died, she's eating tuna fish out of cans and grabbing a donut when she's hungry. So you find all those lifestyle changes. Next slide, please. And again, health promotion can be intervention. Since grief can affect health, counselors should always emphasize and assess self-care and healthful and again health promotion, especially for vulnerable populations, older people, people with chronic conditions, and the like. Next slide. Well, what do we know? What else do we know about morbidity and mortality? And sometimes we know that there are actual we call conversion reactions. And that's when, for some reason, there are constraints to expressing emotion, maybe internal constraints, maybe external constraints. And therefore, what happens then is that they come out in physical reactions, in physical pieces. Next slide, please. Don't go put that one back right now. Okay. Jane Nichols. Jane Nichols was an interesting woman, a dear colleague of mine who died, I think, in the 90s, but a pioneer in perinatal or neonatal loss. And so she, and it really should be perinatal rather than neonatal there. That was a mistake that I didn't catch. But perinatal losses, of course, miscarriages, stillbirths, or losses associated with the birth process. So anyway, what Nichols found was that now remember, when Nichols was doing her research, it was in the late 1960s, and people who had experienced stillbirths and women who had experienced stillbirths and miscarriages often were, any quote unquote counseling was very basically, you're young, you're healthy, go get pregnant again. There wasn't any much support. And so often there were no cards, Hallmark cards for a miscarriage or a stillbirth in those days. There actually somebody did a study where they tracked the enfranchisement of different kinds of losses by looking at Hallmark's catalog over the years and seeing when they first had pet loss cards and when they had cards for miscarriages and stillbirths. So again, there was no validation of grief. And if I could actually if I actually had set up a poll, I would ask you, where do you think these women who had experienced a miscarriage experience pain? And the answers I normally get are stomach, uterus, and the answer is, yeah, that's number 3. Heart and breast comes up very often, number 2. But the biggest reaction that they had, next slide, and you can throw in the image, was pain in their upper arms. Because these are the arms that are used, these are the muscles that are used to lift and to hold a child. And that's where these women experience pain. You see this as a conversion reaction. And again, often that occurs when losses are disenfranchised. Another example of that is I once had a client come in very angry, because her physician had said she had tremors. She had this ever since her husband died. She had this shaking in her hands, and the physician, they did all kinds of tests for Parkinson's, for everything else. They couldn't find any physiological cause. And he said, look at you, you just had a significant loss a few months ago, right around when this started. he said, what I would like you to do is talk to a grief counselor. Well, she didn't like the idea. He referred her to me. She literally walked into my office with tremors, and she said, he thinks this is in my head. Does this look like it's in my head? And I asked her to sit down. And you know, and I don't want you to think that grief counseling goes this quickly and this well. This is my most successful treatment intervention. And just sort of shocked by this whole encounter, the first question I asked was, did you ever have these tremors before? And her answer was, when I was a little girl and I had temper tantrums. The next question was, are you angry now? And as she talked about her anger around the conditions related to the death, the tremors actually stopped. What sort of comment both amused me and annoyed me was she kept talking about what a brilliant physician she had. And I thought, well, okay, but you know, I wasn't so bad either uh, on this one. Okay, another syndrome we talk about in the next slide is the broken heart syndrome. And very early in research, Colin Murray Parks, who's really the grandfather of bereavement studies, a man who just died in his 90s and was productive to the end of his life, literally, found that there were higher rates of morbidity and mortality after grief, especially in older widows. And you know, that go beyond just conversion reactions, really affected them, led to disease, led to death, and the like. And again, next slide, please. This is actually now a medical syndrome called broken heart syndrome or Takotsubo cardiopathology, because this was from a Japanese doctor who actually traced the medical reasons for this. And he found that when under great stress, the heart maintains the main left ventricle, the heart's main pumping chamber weakens. And it can cause sudden heart attacks as a clogged artery, and sometimes again it may not lead to a death, but it may lead to a lot of other symptoms of heart difficulties. So again, we recognize that. Next slide, please. And again, goes back to what we had talked about, that earlier morbidity, earlier mortality. Next slide. And then just to give another brief tangent on this, we also realizes the stress of caregiving. And a number of years ago, a major caregiving study in the United States found that that caregiving, somebody who's ill, is also bad for one's health. And they found that over a 4-year period, caregivers had higher rates of morbidity and mortality than than a non-caregiving sample of you know, semi-matched in characteristics. And again, what that really tells us is a number of things. First of all, we have to really understand and assist caregivers with their stress. And again, the objective factors are not going to surprise you. What tends to be more stressful in caregiving? Well, obviously incontinence, obviously a patient who's non-ambulatory, obviously a situation where there are sleep disturbances. Matter of fact, England and Scandinavia have actually done something that we should learn from, and that they've found that one of the major factors in nursing home admissions was when the caregiver finds their sleep disrupted constantly overnight. You know, if you ever had that happen with a crying child, you know how tough that is. I always remember going out one New Year's and I used to, you know, when we were friends with this couple, they since have deceased, but we talked to them about, you know, what was the most important, you know, what were your wishes for the next year. And one of them, who's was 2 months into her first child, said a good night's sleep. So, you know, what England and Scandinavia do now is they actually have aides that are what they call night sitters. They come in the evening for 8 hours and let the family get a good night's sleep while they take responsibility for the patient, and of course, dementia. And as important as all of these factors are, what this research showed was even more important was the past relationship. So again, when you're assessing, you have to look at that. And again, it's another sort of in its own way example of the mind-body connection. And what I mean by that is if your mother was always, or your father was always there for you, if they were, supportive of you, if your spouse was just, as wonderful a spouse as could be, and they get sick and you have to care for them, it's kind of like, well, payback's tough, but it's time for me to stand out now. But if your spouse, there's a question here. I don't know that night sitters are available in the United States. I guess you can always pay one individually, but we don't have that kind of program, unfortunately. But it'd be a good thing for you to start, or think about, whoever asked that question. I don't mean to do that because that may discourage future questions if I start giving you assignments. In any case, but if your mother was an alcoholic, if your father was abusive, physically or verbally abusive, and then you have to take care of them, that can be extremely difficult. I had one woman who came in for counseling, and her husband had been a raging alcoholic for much of their marriage and literally was dying from cirrhosis of the liver and liver cancer. And of course, he had to give up drinking immediately, and he reverted to the person, as she said, he became the person I married, this wonderful, kind, loving person. But she was just incredibly resentful because she said, I could have had 40 years of that, and instead I lived in hell. And even though he was as kind, that actually just increased her ambivalence and made it worse. So the lesson from this is it's really important for caregivers to assess, for professional caregivers to assess the health of family caregivers as well as the patient, as caregivers have a higher rate of mortality compared to their peers. Next slide. So again, as we move on, we are just beginning to do some interesting research on the grieving brain and what happens to the brain as we're grieving. And I would not hold myself as an expert in this, but I can tell you what some of the research is saying. This is not my area of research. I'm not a neuroscience scientist, but a clinical sociologist. But as the next slide shows, we've learned a number of lessons already. And research has shown that the brain uses dopamine, opioids, and oxytocin to reward and sustain attachment. And these bonds are actually encoded within the brain. And then it recognizes that these ties are gone and over. And it recognizes the ties as both gone and everlasting. So it's a dilemma. These ties make me feel good, but I don't have these ties anymore. I have memories of these ties, and they sometimes help me feel good, but I don't have the ties. And so the next slide reminds us that that there are changes in brain chemistry after these deaths, and again, these changes are dependent, and excuse the misspelling, both the extent of these changes is dependent both on the severity and the complications of grief. But after loss, here's the essential lesson. The brain needs to relearn to live without the person who died. And this is very subtle. It's if you've ate with 50 people for 50 years with somebody, it's eating alone. If you've slept in the bed for 30 years with somebody, it's sleeping alone. So this makes grieving sometimes difficult. The last thing I want to conclude with is some research, as the next slide shows, on that also is about the mind-body connection, which is how do we build resilience? Next slide. And again, resilience is a pattern. And some of the work of George Bonanno has talked about the fact that not everybody has severe reactions to grief, and some people do relatively well with loss. That doesn't mean they love the person any less, but they have a limited reaction to loss. And part of this is the situation, that resilient grievers had fewer losses, they had a little less stress. The death was not so sudden, they had a chance to say goodbye. They had an intrinsic spirituality, however they defined it, so that helped give them meaning, and good psychological health. meaning they didn't have a history of depression or anxiety disorders or things like that that can be triggered by re-triggered by grief. They looked at loss as a challenge. This is going to be a challenge, but I have to deal with that challenge. But we can learn, as the next slide shows, from the resilience of grief. I love this cartoon. I don't know if you can read it, but these fishermen, ironically, are being swallowed by a great fish, sort of Jonah style. And two of them are clearly horrified. And one of them sitting there drinking a beer, enjoying the drift down the gullet. And he says, still, guys, you have to agree. It's ironic that we're being swallowed by a fish. So even in this, he's resilient. So what are resilient grievers? Well, they tended to have an optimistic mindset. They tended to say, this is going to be tough, but I can grow from this. I can learn from this. I can respond to challenges. I've had a history of doing that. And they engender positive memories. So, so when there are people who can say, yeah, I miss Kathy so much. But do you remember the camping trip we took that time? Or remember the skiing trip we took that time? And they're able to do that. So what do we want to take from this? Next slide, please. And I think what we want to take from this is simply to remember that grief is multifaceted. It affects us in all kinds of ways, including physical. And there is a mind-body connection between our grief and the way our body feels in lots of different dimensions, in lots of different ways. And in the next couple of years, as this ongoing dialogue goes between social scientists who are researching grief and neuroscientists who are researching the brain in grief, I think we're going to learn a lot more about that body-mind connection. So I look forward to our time of dialogue. I think I even gave you an extra 5 minutes for questions.
That's great. Thank you so much, Dr. Doka. If folks have questions, if you'd like to put them into the chat, and we can raise them up to Dr. Doka and have this dialogue. I was wondering, one of the things that we're focusing on this year is how to increase the community's capacity to support those who are grieving, to show up, to be there for folks, since most of us turn to our informal networks for support when we're going through grief. Are there ways that we can support this resiliency that you talked about?
Oh, of course, yeah. And I think, communities that do that are have resources like grief centers, like grief groups, like grief libraries, so they tend to be resourceful communities that support resilience. And again, I think they also provide grief education, as you're doing here. And I think they also provide opportunities for rituals. Ritual is a very effective way to, Van Gennep, who wrote a lot about ritual, uses the term liminal. Not a term we use a lot, not a term we may use at all. But what word comes to mind when we use the word liminal? Preliminal? And so, and what we mean by that, and I see a question. I just want to get into answering it immediately. What liminal means is that it happens right at the level of consciousness. So we're taking something in consciously and unconsciously simultaneously. So it's like when you go to a maybe a patriotic event or a wedding, and you find yourself crying, you don't know why you're crying, so it's affecting you. You're seeing what's happening, but something else is happening as well. So and there's a question here: what do you think about rituals of remembrance, say at Thanksgiving? And I'm sort of excited by that question because writing on Van Gennep, I talk about 4 types of therapeutic rituals in my own work. And one of them is a ritual of continuity, which would be a ritual of remembrance. So it may be raising a glass at Thanksgiving for a person who's no longer there. One of the rituals that we do in my house is when we decorate our Christmas tree with my son and daughter-in-law and the grandchildren and a couple of my godchildren if they're over. The first 3 ornaments we put on are memorial rituals that say, we still remember them and they're still part of our life. Another kind of ritual is a ritual of transition, which is a ritual that marks a transition from one phase in grief to another. One of my most powerful stories of this is a client who came to me and said, my husband's dead for 5 years now, middle-aged widow. Said, I want to take off my wedding ring, but I can't seem to take it off, and I want to start dating, but I can't do it with my wedding ring on, and I can't seem to take it off. Whenever I take it off, I get very upset. So it turned out she was Roman Catholic. She had put on the ritual, in the ring, and of course the wedding ceremony. They were both Catholic. They took very seriously. This was a lifetime commitment. And he died after a long illness from Lou Gehrig's disease. And she said it was really tough caregiving because he was a strong man, and as she said, he did not do sick well, was how she phrased it. And so they'd fight all day because, she wasn't strong enough, she wasn't helping him enough, they'd get into these arguments. But every night when they got into bed, they'd put their hands together so their rings touched, and they repeat their wedding vows in sickness and in health, in good times and in bad. So we decided to create a ritual of transition to take off the ring. And the ritual of transition was we arranged to go back to the church in which she and her husband were married. The pastor at the time, not the same pastor, unfortunately, who had married them, but nonetheless a very wonderful person, called her up to the altar. And she had his ring because it was so loose on his finger by the time he was so emaciated by the time he died. The last minute she just took it off, before they closed the casket. And he asked her the questions now in front of her family and witnesses after Mass on Sunday, and said, were you faithful in sickness and in health, in good times and in bad? Past tense. And she can say, I was. And he said, may I have the ring, please? And she said the ring came off as if by magic. And what we had determined to do is that the priest took the rings, had them interlocked, and welded to the frame of her wedding picture. That vow is now complete. Another kind of ritual is a ritual of reconciliation, where you say, I'm sorry. And another kind of ritual is a ritual of affirmation. So yeah, these rituals can be very important and very therapeutic. I'm just going to go through these questions, if that's okay. When I think of resilience, I think of diet, exercise, social contact, meaning, and volunteering, and those are all important, and they help build resilience too. And then please comment on personal journaling about one's grief, both solo and with a grief counselor. Where to start? Start now and do what's ever comfortable. For some people, it may be with a counselor. For some people, maybe it's something they just want to do on their own. Okay. I don't quite understand this question. I'm curious about experiences in somatic practices to support the griever to understand how their body is manifesting grief. Can you figure out what that question is maybe asking?
I think are there ways that we can, are there practices that you know about where people can reflect to understand how they're carrying their grief? It may be
Sure.
places
I
in
would,
the body or
yeah.
ways that they're carrying it.
Yeah, I would say certainly counseling can help. Maybe, whatever's comfortable for a person, maybe meditating, maybe doing some kind of yoga practice. I know some people have taught yoga as a way of working with grief. So there, whatever works. Okay. Have you seen grief issues specific to siblings? Yeah, of course, every grief reaction. EFT, which tapping is a form of somatic therapy. I guess I don't know enough about it. Have you seen grief issues related to specific to siblings? Well, yes and no. I think one of the things we need to realize is that the sibling relationship is probably one of the most unique relationships we have in our life. Our sibling relationships are lifelong. They're probably longer than any other relationship we have in our life. I'm looking forward to Saturday that my sister's coming up to visit. Um, she's um, and we're going to go out for dinner at a restaurant we both like up where I live, and we're looking forward to spending the day together. But we've known each other for all of my 76 years, and most of her, a little older than me, most of her years. If I tell you how many years older, then she'll get annoyed at me, and maybe we won't have as nice a dinner. So I'll leave that out. But I've known her more than I've known my partner, Kathy. I've known her more than I know my son, longer. I know her longer than I know my parents. She's been there for me from the beginning of her life, and I've been there since she's a little girl. So the sibling relationship is unique. Siblings also share memories that nobody else shares. The smell of the cabin in Maine. And siblings also provide assistance to one another in later life. Really third after children and parents. And spouses. I mean, it's spouses, children, and siblings. And the sibling relationship is part of our biography. Part of who I am is Dot's kid brother, Frankie's kid brother. Uh, Now, Helen Rosen has a fascinating book on that, and she points out that you can look at two dimensions in sibling relationships. One is a sort of social dimension. Are they distant from each other physically, or are they in constant contact, close? But again, physical. And then the other is an emotional tone. Is their relationship warm or hostile? And so I would rate my relationship with my sister very warm and close. When my brother, who died a couple of years ago, I would relate it as warm and distant. My brother was 13 years older than me. When I was 3 years old, he went off to the Navy. We didn't really interact much, just because he was, whatever he did, we enjoyed each other's sense of humor. We liked each other. We just didn't see each other. Now, what Rosin says is the more extreme the relationship, the warmer, more hostile, closer, more distant, the more likely there's going to be problems in grieving. So it is a kind of unique relationship. Okay. Yeah, I would say, again, body work and movement therapy, I would agree with that, can be very, very helpful.
Can you talk a little bit about ambiguous loss, and do you see a difference in terms of the way it manifests or can manifest for people?
Yeah, ambiguous loss is a term that was introduced into the field by a wonderful colleague, and I think it's exciting. It's an exciting concept where by Pauline Boss, and lives up in the Minneapolis area. Matter of fact, she'd be a good person to get to do your program at some point in time, if you're interested in ambiguous loss. And she talks about losses where you're physically present but mentally absent, like with dementia, as being ambiguous. Person's still there, or also physically absent but mentally present. Let's say a missing child or somebody missing in action. And those create additional complications because I think Pauline said it, and or somebody said it, but whoever said it well, and I'm pretty sure it was Pauline, who said every good story needs an ending. And the problem with ambiguous loss is you don't always have an ending. You don't know how the story ended. Yeah, I think we're all agreeing that music and body work can be a powerful tool. Any physical activity can be. Uh, Somebody wrote here 10-year mark was significant for her. And I always like to describe grief as as typical grief as a kind of declining roller coaster over time that even after 10 years, you still may get surges of grief, as we talked about earlier. Oh, can you repeat the different types of rituals? Continuity, and they're both two sides of the same coin. So continuity is we're affirming the continuing bond, and then sort of the other side of that is transition, in which we're saying I'm in a different place now in my grief journey, my journey of grief. Then the other ritual is reconciliation, which is where you finish business. You say, I'm sorry. Maybe you write a letter to the deceased and read it at the tomb, at the memorial stone or something like that. But you have some unfinished business. And the last ritual is a ritual of what I called affirmation. And just like reconciliation says, I'm sorry, a ritual of affirmation says, thank you. I told you about my one of my godchildren, my godson Keith, whose dad died literally the day before his 4th birthday. And as I promised his father as he was dying, I would be an influence and a presence in his life, and I was happy to do that, and still have a wonderful relationship with him. As a matter of fact, my son just had a party for my 50th, my 75th birthday and the 50th anniversary of my ordination, and Keith told his mother, yeah, I'm coming out for it from Los Angeles, but don't tell him I want to surprise him. And his mother's solid advice, mother's very practical woman, said, you don't surprise 75-year-olds. But Keith is very special to me, as all my godchildren are. And when he was about 9 years old, we'd take him on vacation with us, and my son Kathy, my son Michael, and Keith were in the car. Michael's 13 years older than Keith, so we were, going on a vacation to Lake George, and I met his father through a delinquency prevention program, and because that was my first interest before I got into dying and death. And one of my favorite stories that I told at his funeral, which was like a signature story of him, and is a signature story of him, is it was what I call a classic 70s program. So in this, in the sense there was no training, no support, no supervision, just go out and do good. But we were encouraged the kid to take these. So what happened is they wanted kids from my neighborhood who were in college to mentor kids at risk for delinquency. So I was volunteered for the program by a mutual friend, and assigned this little boy who was like 10 years younger than me. And I would take him fishing with me, and he had no patience, so he would just constantly tug on the whenever he got stuck until he lost a lure. And one day I opened my tackle box and he threw 10 new lures in there. And I looked at him and I said, Michael, are these hot? And he looked at me and said, I would tell you if they were hot. So I said, I'm sorry. And then about 5 years later, we're fishing. He said, hey, you still got the hot lures. And we had a big thing about honesty. So I said, no, you swore to me they weren't hot. I was annoyed. And he said, no. He said, I remember exactly what I said. He said, I said I would tell you when they were hot. I never said when I'd tell you. And that's a classic, if you knew the kid, he never lied to you, but you had to make sure you asked precisely the right question. In any case, and Keith loved that story. That was Keith's favorite story about his father. So one day, as we're going upstate New York to go on vacation, I said, "Hey, Keith, see that stream that goes to the lake that the story took place in?" So Keith says, "Stop! I want to see it. I want to go there." So we pulled over, and Michael and Kathy said, "We'll stay in the car. This is your moment with Keith." And we found an old lure. And he said, this is a gift from my dad. So we did a ritual of affirmation around that lure, where he gave me the lure and said, this is a gift from my dad, but the best gift I ever got from my dad was you. And I gave him the lure and said, this is a gift from your dad, but the best gift I ever got was you. And then he threw it into the weeds and said, thanks, Dad. So again, those are pieces. I think we have time maybe for one more question, but on another note, I so appreciate your research behind grieving styles. We've done some talk. We started doing research, Terry Martin and I, on gender and grief, and then said, well, gender is one factor, but it's not the only factor. So, do men and women grieve differently? Some do, some don't. But we ended up talking about grieving styles that represent different, that exist along a continuum, and that differ in how much an emphasis is placed on emotion versus action. So that's what that's about.
Wow. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Doka. This was wonderful. I know we could continue on with some more. I have more questions, but we'll have to have another time for that. But we really appreciate you joining us, especially at such a late hour from New York.
Okay, delighted to do so, and we'll take care. Now I can
Thank
finally
you.
have the rest of my glass of wine that I was going to have.
There you go. Wonderful.
Thank you.
And I noticed that maybe if you arrived right before 6 o'clock, thinking that that's when we started, because that's normally when we start, don't worry. This will be available to everyone to view again in about, is it, Jennifer, about a week time that we normally have that back up on our website. So you can click on that and see the presentation in its entirety. And then you'll also have access then to the slides at that point.
Okay. Bye, everybody.
Goodbye, Dr. Doka. Everybody else, you're not allowed to leave. Only Dr. Doka is allowed to leave. Okay. Nobody else go anywhere now. All right, Jennifer, did you want to?
Yes, thanks for sticking around, everyone. Your feedback means so much to us. So we're gonna launch a poll really fast just to get some feedback on Dr. Doka's session. There are 7 questions in the poll, so you'll want to make sure to answer each one before you hit that submit button. If you do accidentally hit the submit button, we can't relaunch your poll specifically, but we can always send you a link to complete the poll on another time. And while you're doing that, David is going to talk to you about the next couple sessions we have lined up.
You're muted.
There we go.
There you go.
We really hope that you all can join us next month on April 18th. That's not April TJ. It's going to be April 18th at our normal time, 6 to 7:30. Rachel Black-Kelter is a wonderful person from Tunadito Children and Family Services. And she's going to be talking about specifically how children and young adults grieve, and also how we can show up for them, what we can do that's unique to their grief in order to support them. So we hope that you will join us for that. And then in May, on the 16th at 6 o'clock, we will have a presentation entitled Where Words Fail, Music Speaks. It will be about the importance of music in our grieving process and in grief support, and also music at end-of-life care as well. So we hope that you can join us for both of those. Go on to our website, register, and then we will send you the reminders so you won't forget.
And I will put a little plug in. We have the rest of the country has entered into daylight savings time. Arizona does not do that. So if you have questions about what time our session starts, I do include a link to a time zone converter in our emails. But I think typically it's about a 3-hour Eastern Standard Time, or Eastern Daylight Time is 3 hours ahead of Arizona. And I want to say that Pacific is maybe an hour behind us. Don't quote me on that, but there is a time zone converter in the emails, so please feel free to use that. And if you have questions, you can always ask and we'll figure it out together. As David and Julie, or David mentioned earlier, we are so grateful for your donations. I did want to share just a couple of other ways that you can help support Roots and Roads as we we try and transform the end-of-life experience. There is our donation website, rootsandroads.org/donations. We have partnered with ShopRaise, which is an app where you can do your online shopping, and a portion of the proceeds go to Roots and Roads. We are also a part of Walmart Spark Goods. So if you do shopping online at Walmart, Walmart Plus, you can designate a portion of your shopping to come to Roots and Roads, as well as Fry's Community Rewards. You can link your shopper's card in your digital account. And then we do also have a card donation program. So if you have an old clunker that you no longer want and you want to donate, it's really simple. There's a form on our website and they take care of everything. They'll come tow it if it's not drivable. And then once they do the processing on their end, they will send a donation to Roots and Roads for that. One of the newest things that we have going for us is that we are now a qualified charitable organization. So for those of you in Arizona, you can designate your Arizona charitable tax credit for Roots and Roads. It's a dollar for dollar tax credit on your Arizona state taxes. So if you haven't done your taxes yet, you do have until April 15th to do that. And then you can always do your donation for next year as well, if you want to get a jump on it. And with that, we are done for the evening. We will hang out for a little while if you want to finish your survey. But other than that, we're so grateful for you guys for joining us, and you guys have a great night.
Night, everybody.
Good night. Take care, everyone.